Good morning, students. I hope you enjoyed the short clip of a Pink Panther episode. If you want to find out how this episode ends, we need to do our English class first. So let's begin. Today we have our 10th edition of our online English class, and today we'll learn more about modal verbs. So open your books to page 376, please. Today's objectives are to improve our grammar comprehension skills. We're going to learn the concept of modal verbs and apply modal verbs correctly in sentences. What are modal verbs? Let's try to break down this concept into the two words that it's made of. Modal means to denote the mood of a verb, and a verb is a word that shows action. So the modal helps us to identify how we're going to use this verb. You're going to see the different categories and meanings to these verbs. So modal verbs are used to express obligation or necessity to do something. Some modal verbs that we use are have to, must, ought to, and should. There are many more, but today we're only going to focus on those 4 modal verbs. So again, please open your book to page 376 to begin our class. You have a chart there that has 3 modal verbs that we are going to learn today. The first one is have to. We use have to if we want to express an impersonal obligation. When someone or when some external power like school rules, job policy, or law forces people to act in a certain way. So this modal verb of have to is to express obligation. Let's look at the examples. Miles has to wear a uniform to work. Alright, have to can be used in all tenses. It is conjugated like any other verb. For example, I had to work extra hours at night. And if we want to change it to a negative, remember we have to use the contraction or the word not. So this one says don't have to is used to show the lack of necessity. That means that you don't need to do something. You don't have to do something, but you can if you want. Tomorrow is Sunday, so kids don't have to wake up early. If it was the opposite, it would have said tomorrow is Sunday, so kids have to wake up early if they have something to do. But it's not a necessity. Must is used to express a personal obligation as well, but this one requires a strong suggestion. Something that the person considers that is necessary to do. Have to is a little bit less than necessity, but must is higher. So I must eat less junk food. Must can be used to talk about present or future. And if we want to talk about the past obligation, we have to use had to. For example, I must go now. That means in the present tense. Now, if we want to change it to a negative, again, remember we use the contraction not and the word not. Mustn't shows prohibition. It refers to something that is not permitted or allowed. You mustn't arrive late to the exam. Now we have the modal verb ought to. Ought to is to say something is the right thing to do because it's someone's duty or because it's correct or polite. This is also a suggestion, but it's not an obligation. It's an advice that you're giving to someone else. We ought to help our grandparents more. We ought to do our homework on time. And of course, if you want to change it to a negative, you use the word not. Ought not to. Keep in mind that this one can't have a contraction. So you use the phrase ought not to. And also, you can change this phrase for shouldn't. They shouldn't order so much food. So ought to. If you want to change it to a negative, you use ought not to or shouldn't. Let's do activity A together, found on page 376. It says fill in the sentences with must, have to, or ought to in the appropriate tense and form. Number 1. You have asked permission to use my computer. I mean, I don't mind you using it, but still I prefer you to ask me for it. So this is an advice. So if it's an advice, what should we use? Correct. Ought to. Number 2. If you were feeling ill, you stay till the end of the party. So this is giving you an obligation, but not necessarily has to be done. It's a possibility. So correct. You can use didn't have to, the negative. Number 3. Blank all fencing competitors blank wear face mask. So we use here do all fencing competitors have to wear face mask? Number 4. You blank stay up till late the night before the finals. If I were you, I would go to bed right away. So it's like an advice, because the person is saying I would go to bed right away if I were you. So the answer is ought not to. Number 5. Blank Mr. Anderson keep medicine away from his children. Here we have to use the opposite of must. You're right, mustn't. Here are your answers for activity A. Remember, you can pause the video if you need more time to check your answers. Now let's turn to page 377 and work on activity B. Imagine that a friend of yours has sprained his ankle while playing football. Fill in the chart below with his obligations, what he has to do, recommendations you can give him, and things that his doctor will probably prohibit. So the first one says your friend's obligation. So we have to use must and have to. What could probably be his obligation if he sprained his ankle? I'll do the first one and you'll do the second sentence in the obligation section. One obligation could be he must stay in bed for a couple of days. Now you have to use the phrase have to in the second sentence for his obligations. The second section says your recommendations. We have to use modal verbs ought to, don't have to, and ought not to. So I wrote, you ought to inform your parents about the accident right away. The third and last section says things his doctor would ask him not to do, using the phrase mustn't. So his doctor might probably say you mustn't skip your therapy sessions. Now let's review some examples from the modal verbs that we just learned. Must and have to, we use it to express obligation. Number 1, you must turn in your homework before Friday. Number 2, David will have to clean his room if he wants to go outside and play. Ought to and should are used to express an advice or to suggest an advice. You ought to revise your work before you send it to your teacher. And number 2, we should sleep at least 9 hours a day. Now that you have completed your English lesson, you can find out how the Pink Panthers episode ends. See you soon in our next class. Goodbye, students.